question of terrorism is crucial in our times because we are often told that groups committed to certain ideologies threaten innocent civilians, and even our civilization itself. Once we are told this, the next step is to demand a symphony of condemnation. Do you disavow? But what happens when countries become terrorists? For example, very recently, when Israel caused pagers and walkie-talkies to blow up, killing scores and injuring thousands, was this not an act of terrorism, in that ordinary people were targeted, as they went about their daily lives? This leads us to clarify and understand the difference between state terrorism and state-sponsored terrorism. State terrorism refers to acts of violence conducted by a government against its own citizens or other states, often with the intent to instill fear and maintain control. This concept encompasses a range of actions carried out by state agents, including military, police, or intelligence agencies, targeting both domestic and foreign individuals or groups. State terrorism is characterized by the systematic use of violence aimed at creating a climate of fear. This can include acts such as genocide, mass murder, ethnic cleansing, torture, and disappearances. Governments may justify these actions as necessary for national security, combating dissent, suppressing insurgencies, or claims of self-defense. However, such actions are often criticized as severe violations of human rights and international law. Unlike traditional warfare, state terrorism often deliberately targets civilians to achieve broader political goals, aiming to intimidate not just the immediate victims but also the wider population. But it is also important to differentiate between state terrorism and state-sponsored terrorism. As we have seen, state terrorism refers to acts of violence perpetrated directly by agents of a government against its own citizens, or other states. This violence is politically or ideologically motivated and is aimed at instilling fear, suppressing dissent, or maintaining control over a population. Examples include extrajudicial killings, torture, and other forms of oppression carried out by state forces such as police or military units. The characteristics of state terrorism are, first, that it is conducted by state agents, for example, government officials and military personnel. Second, it often targets civilians or political dissidents. Third, it aims to intimidate the population, eliminate opposition, or consolidate power. State-sponsored terrorism, on the other hand, involves the provision of support by a government to non-state actors who then engage in terrorist activities. This support can include funding, training, weapons, and logistical assistance, enabling these groups to carry out violent acts against other states or groups. The characteristics of state-sponsored terrorism are the following. First, the perpetrators are non-state actors, such as groups and organizations, who receive support from a sponsor state to carry out terrorist acts. Second, the targets of state-sponsored terrorism are foreign governments, civilians in other countries, or even domestic groups opposing the sponsor state. Third, the purpose of state-sponsored terrorism is to support the strategic interests of the sponsor state, such as destabilizing rival nations, or advancing ideological goals without direct military engagement. And because non-state actors are used, the sponsor state has deniability. It can deny any direct involvement. Given what is happening in Gaza and now in Lebanon, is Israel, then, a terrorist state? The entire world now sees that Israel uses its army, the Mossad, and other intelligence agencies to execute violence against civilians that Israel labels as terrorists, in order to gain control and impose suppression. Israel uses violence to target civilians or political dissidents, and it does so in order to intimidate the entire, rival population, and to eliminate opposition, and thereby consolidate power. We know that all Israeli military attacks disproportionately impact civilians, with significant casualties among Palestinians, and now Lebanese, as compared to Israelis. We also know that Israel intentionally targets residences, schools, places of worship, and hospitals, which constitute a form of genocide against the Palestinian and Lebanese people. Also, While attacks by Hamas and Hezbollah are condemned as terrorism, there is a double standard when it comes to Israel, which can carry out terroristic violence with impunity. The recent pager and walkie-talkie explosions targeted civilians on a massive scale, killing nearly 50 and seriously injuring more than 3,700. Communication devices that ordinary people use every day were turned into lethal bombs. As well, given the lethality of the bombing in Gaza and Lebanon, in which mostly civilians, many of them women and children, have been killed or injured, can only be defined as collective punishment, which violates international law. For how can children be labeled as terrorists? Those that defend Israel make the following arguments. First, that Israel has the right to self-defense against terrorist threats, particularly from groups like Hamas, which is recognized as a terrorist organization by several countries, including the US and EU. They contend that Israel's military actions are responses to aggression, particularly following attacks, such as the one on October 7, 2023, where Hamas launched a significant military operation resulting in many Israeli casualties. Although it has also to be noted that the majority of the casualties that fateful day were inflicted by the Israeli army, as it implemented the Hannibal option, where it is preferable to kill fellow Israelis, rather than allow them to become prisoners. The problem with this first pro-Israeli argument is that it hangs upon a technicality, the designation of who is a terrorist. What Israel calls terrorists are known as freedom fighters by the Palestinians. Why is Israel's designation universally accepted, while that of the Palestinians is not? And if the Israeli designation is universal, then on what basis? And this questioning is bolstered by the fact that the UN itself recognizes Israel as an occupier of Palestinian territories, and thus it is the right of the occupied to resist the occupier. The designation of Israel as an occupier primarily stems from its control over the Palestinian territories of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, which began after the Six-Day War in 1967. Israel's occupation of these territories is widely regarded as illegal under international law. The International Court of Justice has stated that the occupation violates several fundamental principles, including the prohibition against acquiring territory by force and the right to self-determination for peoples. The United Nations has also issued reports indicating that Israel's policies, particularly regarding settlement expansion and land appropriation, amount to de facto annexation, which is unlawful under international law. International law does not permit an occupying power to annex land or settle its civilians in occupied territories. Then, there are human rights violations with systematic discrimination against Palestinians, and violations of their rights, including housing and property rights, summary arrests, illegal detentions, torture, beatings, and even murder, all of which have been documented extensively. Various UN resolutions have called for Israel to cease settlement activities and recognize Palestinian rights, resolutions which reaffirm the illegality of Israel's actions in occupied territories. The second pro-Israel argument asserts that terrorism is defined by the intentional targeting of civilians to instill fear for political purposes. This argument says that Israel's military operations, while resulting in civilian casualties, are aimed at military objectives and are conducted within the framework of international law, seeking to minimize harm to non-combatants. This distinction is crucial in debates about the legitimacy of state actions versus those of non-state actors labeled as terrorists. The problem, again, with this argument, is that it hangs upon another technicality. What constitutes a military target? It is easy for Israel to designate any place a military target and then bomb it. Who is ever going to investigate whether what Israel said about a house or hospital, that military ordnance was hidden there and thus needed to be bombed, was true or not? The place has been blown out of existence. There is nothing left to investigate. But what is certain is massive civilian casualties. Therefore, Israel consistently uses this clever technicality and freely bombs residences, schools, hospitals, churches and mosques, and even refugee camps, with ordinary Palestinians sheltering in tents. Any place can become a military target, by Israel saying so. The third pro-Israeli argument cites international law that recognizes a state's right to use force in self-defense against armed attacks. The third pro-Israeli argument states that Israel's military responses are legally justified under Article 51 of the UN Charter, which allows for self-defense against armed attacks, until the Security Council takes measures to maintain international peace and security. In this way, a legal perspective frames Israel's actions as defensive rather than terroristic. The weakness of this argument is obvious. International law also states that an occupier does not have the right to self-defense in occupied territories, where the occupied have the legal right to put up resistance. Bombing the occupied, who resist oppression of the occupier, cannot legally be classified as self-defense by the occupier, because it is only the occupied who are rightly defending themselves. And the occupied de jure cannot be terrorists. But notice the trick in each of these three justifications of Israel's use of violence. Atrocities are disguised in legalese. The Palestinians are labeled as terrorists. Israeli brutality is labeled as self-defense. Israeli bombs are dropped on areas that Israel has labeled as military targets. It's just that civilians keep getting in the way of these legal actions, and so end up dying the most. But that's not Israel's fault, which only bombs terrorists and military targets. Here the notion of human shields is brought up, where Hamas and now Hezbollah are said to intentionally place military ordnance in homes, schools, places of worship, and hospitals, and Israel is therefore forced to bomb these places. It is a clever argument, for once a home or tent has been bombed and those inside killed, who can say what was inside? The human shield's justification is simply code for collective punishment, which is meant to instill fear in the civilian population. Therefore, Israel can slaughter because it can always frame everything in legal phraseology, of who are terrorists, and what is a military target. And once we begin to question this legalese, we are left with the starkest reality: Israel is indeed a terrorist state because it uses mass slaughter of innocent civilians to intimidate the population, eliminate opposition, and consolidate power. Israel truly believes that the only way to live in this world is by handing out massive violence to all its neighbors. This raises a crucial question. Why has Israel chosen to be universally hated, rather than loved and admired? Rather than being a friend, it has chosen to be an enemy. Why?